There's a reason cult stories never really stop being fascinating. And it's not because people are obsessed with weird outfits or strange rituals. It's because cults are basically pressure cookers for human psychology. They show how quickly confidence can become certainty, how certainty can become obedience, and how obedience can become a life that doesn't belong to you anymore. And if the first episode was the big famous nightmare batch, the second one is the mix that proves cults can thrive in any era, any country, and any social class. Some of these groups marketed themselves as self-improvement programs. Some dressed their beliefs up as religion. Some became international headlines. And some quietly destroyed people for years before the public even learned the name. So here are 5 more crazy cults that actually existed.
Keith Raniere.
Keith Raniere.
Keith Raniere.
Vanguard. NXIVM.
NXIVM. Keith Raniere.
Keith Raniere. Vanguard.
Keith Raniere. Allison Mack.
NXIVM. Allison Mack.
Keith Raniere. NXIVM.
Keith Raniere. Allison Mack.
NXIVM.
NXIVM.
Allison Mack.
Allison Mack.
This one I actually pronounced completely wrong through the whole deep dive, so there's that. NXIVM didn't look like a cult at first glance, and that's exactly why it worked. On the surface, it sold itself as a professional development company, seminars, coaching, unlock your potential language. It had the kind of glossy branding that makes people lower their guard because it feels closer to corporate motivation than spiritual extremism. And then, once people were in, the system didn't just ask them to improve themselves, it asked them to surrender themselves, piece by piece, to a hierarchy that rewarded obedience and punished doubt. Keith Raniere positioned himself as the smartest person in the room, the guy with the answers, the one who could diagnose your flaws and fix your life. That dynamic is a classic cult move, even when it's wearing a business suit. Because once the leader becomes the source of the truth, you start measuring your own reality against whatever he says. If you're uncomfortable, that's your growth edge. If you're hesitant, that's your fear. If you're upset, that's your limitation. And suddenly, every normal internal alarm you have gets reinterpreted as a personal failure instead of a warning sign. What makes NXIVM especially disturbing is how it layered secrecy on top of status. People were taught the deeper you went, the more special you were. There were ranks, privileges, access, and the constant implication that outsiders just wouldn't understand what you were building. And when you combine exclusivity with shame, you can trap people without chains. Because leaving doesn't just mean walking away, it means admitting you were fooled, losing your social world, and risking retaliation from a group that's trained you to believe it knows you better than you know yourself. The scandal finally exposed NXIVM, shattered the self-help mask that revealed how extreme the control had become. The details that came out weren't just about manipulation. They were about exploitation, coercion, and a structure designed to break people down and make them feel like they owed the group their loyalty, their silence, and their bodies. And that's the reason NXIVM belongs in a list like this. It proves you don't need a remote compound or an apocalyptic prophecy to build a cult. Sometimes you just need a charismatic leader, a clean brand, and a system that teaches people to doubt themselves before they ever doubt him.
Children of God.
David Berg.
The Children of God.
The Children of God.
David Berg.
Children of God.
The Children of God.
Children of God cult.
The Family International.
The Children of God cult.
David Berg. David Berg. David Berg. The Children of God.
The Family International.
Children of God.
Children of God cult.
David Berg.
Children of God.
Infamous Children of God cult.
Children of God is one of those names that doesn't always hit mainstream memory the way Jonestown or Manson does, but once you learn what went on inside, it's hard to understand how it lasted as long as it did. The group began with a kind of wandering, countercultural religious vibe, pulling in young people who were searching for meaning, belonging, and a life that felt more real than the world they came from. But the reality behind the spiritual language was control, isolation, and a set of beliefs that became a vehicle for systematic abuse. The most shocking aspect of Children of God is the way leadership justified sexual exploitation through doctrine. In a lot of cults, you see leaders twist scripture or spirituality to demand money, labor, or loyalty. Here, the twisting went into territory that was openly predatory. The group's internal logic didn't just blur boundaries, it demolished them. And it trained members to treat the leader's ideology as more important than basic human safety. That kind of environment didn't just damage people in the moment. It rewires what they think is normal, what they think they deserve, and what they think that love even is. Children of God also demonstrate something that makes cults uniquely hard to dismantle: normalization through community. If you're surrounded by people who insist the rules are moral, the rules start to feel moral. If everyone around you frames harm as spiritual, harm starts to feel like obedience. And if your entire social world, housing, food, and identity are tied to the group, then the cost of leaving can feel unbearable, even when staying is clearly destroying you. This is one of those cases where the crazy part isn't goofy or theatrical. It's the way a belief system can be weaponized to make cruelty feel like a sacred duty. And it's a reminder that cult damage isn't always about a single explosive ending. Sometimes it's about years of hidden harm that only becomes visible when survivors finally speak and the public finally listens.
David Koresh.
The Branch Davidian compound. Of the Branch Davidian compound.
David Koresh.
The Branch Davidian compound. David Koresh.
Cult leader David Koresh.
David Koresh.
Waco is one of the most recognizable cult stories in American history, but it's also one of the most complicated because the ending became a national trauma and a political lightning rod. The Branch Davidians were led by David Koresh, a man who blended religious authority with personal dominance and convinced followers that he was central to biblical prophecy. Like a lot of cult leaders, Koresh didn't just interpret scripture. He made himself the key to it. And once people believed that, obedience wasn't just loyalty to a man, it was loyalty to God's plan. The standoff in 1993 didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after growing concern, allegations, and a tense relationship between the group and the outside world. And once federal agents were involved, the situation escalated into a long, highly public confrontation that played out in real time in the media. That media presence matters because it turned the event into something more than a cult story. It became a national spectacle, and every decision, rumor, and image fed the pressure cooker. What makes Waco belong on this list isn't just the fact that it was famous, it's the way the case shows how cult dynamics can collide with law enforcement dynamics and how quickly everything can spiral when the leader frames the outside world as an enemy army. In cult logic, confrontation can actually strengthen belief. It can be reframed as persecution, proof, and prophecy coming true. And when followers are isolated, terrified, and convinced that end is inevitable, you're no longer dealing with normal negotiation. You're dealing with a closed reality. The end of the standoff is still debated and still painful, but in terms of cult behavior, the pattern is clear. Koresh's control over his followers was powerful enough that even as the world watched, people stayed. And whether someone views the final outcome through a political lens, a law enforcement lens, or a religious lens, the core cult lesson remains the same. When a leader convinces people that leaving equals spiritual death, physical danger starts to look acceptable. That's what makes Waco such a brutal example of how belief can trap people even when the exit is right there in front of them. This one is less famous in everyday conversation, but the story is so extreme that it almost feels unreal when you first hear it. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God was an apocalyptic group in Uganda that revolved around end times prophecy and rigid moral control. The group's leaders claimed spiritual authority, demanded strict obedience, and positioned their followers as the righteous few in a world that was about to be judged. Apocalyptic cults have a pattern that's painfully consistent. They create urgency, they create fear, they create a timeline, and they use that timeline to justify anything. If the world is ending soon, then normal rules don't apply. If salvation depends on obedience, then doubt becomes a sin. And if the leader is the only one who understands the plan, then questioning the leader becomes questioning God. That's how ordinary people can be pushed into extraordinary compliance. The horrifying part is this case is how the promised deadline became a weapon. When prophecy fails, cults tend to either collapse or radicalize. And in the darkest outcomes, the leader doesn't admit he was wrong. He changes the rules, tightens control, and finds a way to turn disappointment into obedience. That's where the danger lives, because followers who sacrificed everything can feel like they have no choice but to keep believing. The cost of admitting the truth becomes too high. This group's story ended in mass death, and it's one of the starkest reminders that end-of-the-world beliefs aren't just weird. They can become lethal when they're paired with isolation, absolute authority, and a leader who sees followers as disposable pieces in a prophecy narrative. It's a case that deserves more public awareness, not because it's sensational, but because it's a clear example of what happens when fear becomes religion and the leader becomes law.
People say I'm no good, but they never do they say why their world is so mixed up, or how it got that way.
The Manson family is famous in a way that almost feels separate from the actual story, because the name Manson becomes a cultural shorthand for evil. But the cult dynamics underneath the infamy are what make it so important. Charles Manson didn't have an army. He didn't have a mainstream church. He had charisma, manipulation, and a talent for targeting people who were vulnerable, searching, or drifting. He built a small world where he was the center, and he used music, drugs, ideology, and psychological pressure to turn that world into a trap. One of Manson's strongest tools was identity erosion. The more time people spent in his orbit, the more their old life faded. They were separated from family and normal routines, fed constant messaging, and encouraged to see the outside world as fake, corrupt, or hostile. That separation is where cult control deepens, because once your social world is the cult, leaving doesn't just mean leaving a leader, it means losing everyone you know. The violence associated with the Manson family is what made the case explode into global headlines. But it's worth remembering that the cult machinery didn't begin with murder. It began with dependence, with a leader who framed himself as the only one who truly understood reality, and with followers who were conditioned to obey his will. That's why this case still matters. It shows how a small group can produce massive cultural shock when the leader's control reaches the point where followers will commit acts they never would have imagined before the cult rewired their boundaries. And the reason it belongs as the closer to this list is because it's the most widely recognized cultural symbol of cult violence. It's the one that people reference even when they don't know the details. But when you zoom in, it's also a reminder that cult power isn't always about size. Sometimes it's about intensity, about how completely a leader can take over a small circle of people and turn them into extensions of his own delusion. So if the first batch was about the cults that feel like towering monuments in history, this batch is the reminder that cults don't need a single look to be dangerous. They can wear self-help branding. They can wear religious language. They can wear counterculture freedom. They can even look like a scheduled little community that no one should worry about. The common thread is always the same: control. Once a leader convinces you that your doubts are the problem and his authority is the solution, everything that comes next can be justified. And if you want the deeper, full documentary versions of these stories, that's exactly why Cult Classic exists. These are the fast hit gateways. The deep dives are already waiting. And it already has its own playlist. 11 full deep dive episodes of each one of the 10 cults that we've covered so far.